As our platforms become more national, more global in scope, we must remember that the need for local news does remain a vital element of the fabric of our communities, the fabric of our societies. The story of our cities, our towns, our communities, and individuals can reflect our greatest strengths and our greatest needs. Through this prism, we realize once again that a crucial role of any journalist is to give voice to those who need help being heard. As Hannah said, give voice to the voiceless. And this is the case with our next guests. He is a freelance journalist and policy analyst, and she is the host of the CBC News podcast, Missing and Murdered, Finding Cleo. Please welcome Julian Brave NoiseCat and Connie Walker. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. I'm really excited to be here. We're here today to talk about reporting in Indigenous communities. That's something that we both know a lot about and are passionate about because we're both Indigenous journalists. I'm based here in Toronto and Julian's based in Washington, D.C. I just want to start off by saying that I've been a journalist for almost 20 years now, and when I first started, I've always been interested in telling stories from our communities. I've always felt that they're important, but for a long time there wasn't interest in our newsrooms for these stories. I remember the first MMIW story that I pitched was back in 2006 when somebody who I knew from back home in Saskatchewan had gone missing. And it was the same summer that a blonde white woman from Toronto went missing. And I remember going into a pitch to my boss that we should do a story and compare their coverage. And I was just getting started about why I thought this was an important story. And my boss held up her hand and said, "This isn't another poor Indian story, is it?" And I think about that moment a lot because for the last 7 years, I feel like I've had a front row seat into what's been an incredible transformation in terms of not just the number of stories that are told from our communities, but the kinds of stories in Canada in particular. There's finally a recognition, there's an appetite and interest in that they're important stories. Now, Julian, you're based in Washington. Yes, that deserves a round of applause, yes. Well, there's obviously a lot of competing interests in mainstream media. Are you seeing the same kind of shift in the States?
Yes. And the reason is that it's just a remarkable story. Everywhere you go in this continent, you are on Indigenous land. Everywhere you go on this continent, no matter which side of that border you're on, you're in a place where Indigenous lives were lost. You're in a place where likely Indigenous children were taken away. You are probably in a community where Indigenous women go missing and murdered far more often than their non-Indigenous peers. That's the reality everywhere in the United States and Canada. We are overrepresented in prisons and underrepresented in universities, to say nothing about newsrooms. But despite all of that, today Indigenous peoples in the US and Canada are rising. There were 1 million people who checked in on Facebook to Standing Rock. One of the biggest stories and biggest political controversies in Canada was when Indigenous people stood up to the Prime Minister against the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And this year in the United States, we have the first 2 Native American women in Congress. And if that full sweep of history, that ongoing story, is not a compelling pitch to an editor, I'm not really sure what is. And I think that today we see editors and publications in Canada really catching on to this, and slowly but surely their counterparts to the South are as well.
Yeah. I think one of those big things that have kind of helped shift this coverage is the number of Indigenous journalists in newsrooms. It's still, not where it needs to be. There's a lot of improvement. But why is Indigenous representation in newsrooms important, in your view?
Well, I think your career is an example of why Indigenous representation in newsrooms is so important. But I think that experience, right, of knowing and understanding that history, of having that history as part of your family's story, of having the comfort and ability to go into these communities that are often, have the experience of their stories being abused, of not feeling comfortable, telling those and sharing those stories to outsiders. I think all of that means that having people who can go and do that reporting responsibly, do that reporting well, and often that means Indigenous peoples in the newsroom is so important.
Actually, something that Brian just said about giving a voice to the voiceless, I feel like that's a really interesting concept to unpack when it comes to Indigenous communities, because I would say that we don't need a voice, actually. We have a voice. We have a very strong voice. We just need more microphones. And that's something that I heard from another journalist from a marginalized community talking about, the importance of not just telling stories from Indigenous communities, dropping in and taking someone's story, but actually meaningfully commit to helping to amplify voices from Indigenous communities and give them agency to tell their own stories, and the importance of that, and also, you talked about lived experience and how, sometimes I think as an Indigenous journalist, people will see me reporting on an Indigenous issue and think that, I must be an advocate or I must have some kind of agenda. I feel like I'm an advocate for the truth about the reality that Indigenous people live in Canada and in North America, and really helping people understand, the truth about our shared history, that we've lived alongside one another for 500 years, but there is still so much misunderstanding and about the realities that Indigenous people have lived and what our history has been, and how that's continuing to impact stories today, how missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is connected to child welfare, how it's connected to the ongoing overrepresentation of Indigenous people who are incarcerated. There's so many issues where if you peel that back, it's connected to this shared history that not enough people know about. And I think that one of the things that as Indigenous journalists we sometimes talk about is helping our colleagues who are non-Indigenous do a better job of telling these stories. What advice do you have for non-Indigenous journalists who are interested in reporting in Indigenous communities?
I think that and this goes beyond actually just reporters. I think that it's important for everyone in the United States and Canada to understand that remarkable story of pain, of genocide, as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has deemed it, but also of resurgence, of enduring struggles for rights, for dignity. That is not just an Indigenous story, that is all of our story, right? Those treaties are your founding documents as well. Those residential schools were founded by your churches. They were founded by your federal government. Those children were taken away by your federal government. And that pipeline, if you are a taxpayer in Canada, is owned by you. So this story that we share is not just an Indigenous story, it's all of our story. And so all of us as reporters, in order to get that full story, all of us as news consumers, it belongs to all of us, and we all need to take interest in it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for having us. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you.
Thank you.